The Spiritually Incorrect Podcast with me, your host, Steven Lubka. For those who are not familiar with me, I am the author of the Advaitaholics Anonymous books, Sobering Insights for Spiritual Addicts, and a Manifesto for Spiritual Anarchy, published by New Sarum Press. They're available through Amazon in Kindle and paperback formats, and you can find them by clicking the links in the description below. My purpose with the Spiritually Incorrect podcast series is to connect and engage with other writers, thinkers, and teachers in the industry to explore some of the topics I cover in my books beyond the realm of my own opinions on the matter. So with that being said, I'd like to welcome my next guest, Steven Lubka, a spiritual seeker turned Bitcoin investor. He runs a private wealth team for a Bitcoin exchange. Welcome, Steven.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, not a problem at all. So it's funny how we met. I think we met through my page, and it's quite random actually, because I don't think you were necessarily a reader of my books, but I think it was maybe sometime last year when we had conversation in the comments section of one of my posts, and we found that we share quite a few views in common, especially around this whole spiritual industry and what spirituality means and that kind of stuff. And you'd mentioned, if I remember correctly, you talked about your own sort of awakening experience in the past and some of the lessons that you learned from that experience and how you've learned to integrate it into your daily life. So did you want to give a little bit of background on that?
Yeah, sure. So for me, I mean, I guess I experienced, just to give a little background, I feel like my life had kind of two segments or arcs from, like 18, onward to, when I was a, young adult for, probably 7 or 8 years. I was totally obsessed. I mean, like spiritual seeking was my core orientation. There was something in me that got, lit up, and that was the direction my life took. And, in that, and especially in kind of the earlier and, even middle and later stages of that process, there was a lot of engagement with, obviously, books and the community and teachers and practices and all of these things that I think people, they recognize something in that impulse, and then they turn to these resources and people kind of to make sense of it, right? Because there's maybe not a whole lot of cultural context. There's not a whole lot of, like, you can't look to your society and say, oh yeah, this is what you do when suddenly you're, this desire, that there's something more. Even during that process, I think I was probably always a little contrarian. I was always a little kind of unconventional. I never really worked with teachers. I never had a formal sit down, back straight meditation practice. I did meditate. I did it in my own way. It was usually like just small intervals throughout the day, very frequently. But largely those were always things that had kind of felt right to me, rather than gleaned from a book or a novel or someone's instruction set. But nevertheless, it's hard to go through that process without engaging in the community and the writing and the teaching and being shaped and influenced by that. And so I'm sure we'll get into that, but that, was my kind of my sole focus. And when that process came to an end, I very quickly realized, I think I had this bias. I had this assumption that, like, awakening was kind of like the be all end all mark in the sand. And like, once that was crossed, all questions, all things that I might need to think about would be just rendered in a state of total clarity. And I very, very quickly realized, within days or a week that, it really doesn't directly change your day-to-day life. It's not going to get rid of your pain, your desire, your longing. It's not going to shape the content, with a caveat, but not going to directly shape the content of ordinary experience. And your life will largely be as it was. There's an important caveat, because there is, I think, something that profoundly changes in how we experience and where we experience that from. But the actual content, our emotions, our struggles, our challenges, thoughts, desires, all of that is literally unchanged. And within, I was pissed. I was actually literally angry for like several weeks. I was like, what the hell was the point of all this? I thought I was going to get something. I thought something was going to change in a certain way. And I was like, it's exactly the same. My experience is exactly the same. Caveat, as I said, paradoxically, it's also fundamentally altered from how we experience that. And over time, that became clearer and more profoundly part of my experience. But in that initial kind of integration, I very quickly realized that I needed to figure out all the questions of the world in terms of career and money and my life and what I'm going to do, and all of these kind of normal day-to-day concerns, which, I'm not going to say like I wasn't, sitting, on a mountain somewhere. I was still living, an ordinary life before that, but all of my attention and focus was on spiritually seeking. And there was a meaningful pivot to me, where I just, and from a new space, but I became passionately focused, over a period of years, just on the world, on work, on money, on my life, on understanding just this world and the complexity of the modern, this modern society we live in. I think we live in a society that is more complex than what we're used to, than history. And the good thing is that became a real passion for me. Like, I loved that. It wasn't a chore. It interested me. And I do think that the spiritual process before that gave me a really good foundation to engage in it. But I, became incredibly focused and driven there, and, for a number of years. And that almost was the most, and in that it taught me, and there was, I think, a real integration and a profound insight that I personally feel that it is that integration into our normal human life that is really where the fruit of this whole spiritual undertaking, blossoms. That's what matters, in how it comes into our human life and shapes that. So that's a little bit about me, a little background.
And it's very interesting to me that, at least this was the case for me, is that part of the spiritual search has to do with the disillusionment with the world, the material world, right? There's something that feels off about it. And part of that rebelliousness is, I want to live in a way that I don't have to participate in this madness, okay? That's where it starts. I'm not saying that's where it ends up. It kind of starts out like that.
Absolutely.
Or it did for me, right? And so it's almost like when you pursue this path of spiritual seeking, you're hedging your bets on the fact that you will never have to learn those practical tools, because you'll be exempt from them. You're going to reach this place of peace, equanimity, whatever, where none of this stuff is going to concern you. Money, whatever, right? Or, responsibilities, whatever. All this kind of stuff is not going to bother a person anymore, because they've transcended it. And I think the real letdown is exactly what you said, is you come right back and say, fuck, nothing about any of that has changed. Those social contracts that need to participate, the need to take care of my physical self and anyone who depends upon me, the need to feed myself, clothe myself, shelter myself, none of that has gone away. My need to deal with difficult people, difficult emotions, none of that goes away. And so it becomes like, holy crap, have I wasted my time? And, you know, a lot of people don't even want to go there, right? Like people have spent 20 years, 30 years seeking. Have they lost 20, 30 years of their life on a foolish pursuit? But I don't think that's the case either, because you're exactly right. You're now engaging from a completely different place. You're not engaging from some abstract place that a character named Shiv or a character named Steven inhabits, this ideological entity. You're engaging from exactly where you are in this moment. And that's a powerful starting point. If you don't have that starting point, you're basically just like dangling, you know, like a loose end in the wind, trying to make it through life. But here, it's about grounding yourself, and that's really where the spiritual path took me. For me, though, I struggled for a very long time to get to that pace of, okay, now I want to engage with life. Seems like for you, it happened quite effortlessly, like that switch from, oh man, really? Is this what it's about? And to, oh, I want to get to know the world. Happened, sounds like it happened fairly quickly. For me, it took a bit of time because I was more in denial. I was like digging my heels and like, no, there must be a way. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it was, I had a tumultuous couple months, which in the larger scale of things was pretty quick. I was kind of went through an intense but short period of disillusionment. I remember even talking to my girlfriend and being like, there was no point to any of this. Like it was literally like everything's exactly the same. And that's not how I feel today, right? That was the part of me that, like you said so beautifully, was in it to be free from the world, that I wanted out. I looked at the world, and as so many of us do, I would argue almost everybody engaged in this, and they see, oh, all the problems and the issues and the complexity, and I just want to be totally beyond that. And so that part of me was the part that was disappointed, that was disillusioned, that was like, oh, I'm not going to get that, am I? I actually felt closer. I actually felt closer to the world. I felt more intimate with it. And it was interesting because that actually, my life went through a total, very rapid upheaval in those, let's just say 6 months after. And I walked away from a business I had started that was dysfunctional, a business partner, a longtime friend of mine that the relationship was not in a good place. I actually, you know, I moved from Michigan, where I was running a business, back to Florida, and I was, you know, young then. You know, that was my first kind of venture, and I literally moved in with my mom, and we had always had a tumultuous relationship at that time. And so then in a couple months, I left that, and we literally didn't speak for a year. And these were the kind of common thread here. And the reason I say that is these were all areas where like I was compromising. I was staying in situations, in work, in relationships that were not good for me. They were not, you know, where I needed to be. And it was almost the awakening, you know, process. I almost felt like a greater intimacy. And it was like I couldn't tolerate the dysfunction anymore. So I had this kind of total upheaval, total life restart. And coming out the other side of that process, born of, I mean, I'm not going to lie, necessity. I mean, when I came out of that, I probably had $3,000 in my bank account, no traditional work history, didn't know what I was going to do. And I had to rebuild you know, my whole life from scratch. And so there was, you know, necessity is kind of the mother of all things here. But I learned to love it, and I learned to engage. And that actually formed the foundation where my life got rebuilt, and just from a new perspective that, I mean, I think really shaped the way I engaged and where I took myself. And you know, I'm deeply grateful for that. But it was that part of me that was looking to escape, that was, you know, fundamentally disillusioned. And, you know, instead it got greater intimacy with experience.
Yeah, I find that, you know, most people that I engage with, on an everyday basis, whether they be spiritually oriented people or people who have nothing to do with spirituality, whatever, at work or, moving around in society. I find that most people seem to be living outside of their lives looking in. They're not really fully inhabiting their lives.
Yeah.
They seem to have an idea of who they want to be or who they're expected to be. They're fully trying to inhabit that role, that picture they have in their minds. And they're not really present in their own lives. And so what they seem to be struggling to reconcile at all times is where they believe they are versus what is actually happening around them. And there's this constant tension between the two. I know I felt this tension in my life for a very, very long time. And so I get what you mean by that intimacy, because that whole awakening experience is essentially about transporting yourself out of the idea of yourself and that external point which you're constantly inhabiting, and right to the center of where you are, your center of yourself, in your body, in your being. And from that place, everything you encounter is intimate because it's real. It's not an idea, it's the actual thing. And if you can then invest in your life from that place, then everything becomes worthwhile. You're not trying to create value. Value is being brought by you into the experiences, whether that be a work engagement, whether that be a relationship, whether it be a casual acquaintance, whatever it is, right? Anything that we're doing, we're bringing the intimacy. We're not looking for the intimacy to arrive, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's exactly that leads me to, I'll often describe it as it's redemptive. I found it to be, it's very redemptive. It's what you're saying there, in that, like, we've spent our whole lives in this idea that's, this idea of who we should be, what we should want, how we should engage. And ultimately, we're not in our direct, real lived experience. But when we come into that, it's all of the stuff we were trying to run from, escape, transcend. It becomes so real, so close. And like you said, meaning occurs naturally. And in that, there's almost this redemption, of our human life, of the world, of everything going on, that, I just find caused me to just view it from a completely different perspective. Life is the same, but the way I see it was transformed irrevocably. And so much of that, it just comes from actually inhabiting our real life, our real experience, what we're actually feeling, doing, perceiving. And there's an intelligence, I think, that bubbles up in that. I wouldn't trade the way my life went, or the kind of doing the whole spiritual search first for the world, because I think when we're really inhabiting our actual life, our real moment-to-moment experience, there's a natural intelligence. We're experiencing our system and every faculty that is available to us responding to what is actually happening. And it allows us to make, literally in our day-to-day life, make different choices, act from different places. And it's, while awakening doesn't guarantee anything or any sort of success or functionality, or that you'll do something well or not well, I think being able to maneuver from that place of intelligence and responsiveness does open the door, at least, for us to be much more effective in our life.
Yeah, it's the difference between what I would call having values versus experiencing value, right?
Yeah.
And I think most people are taught to have values being these ideological, arbitrary, consensus-driven systems of belief, right? So, I mean, regardless of what the value system is, it could be a political ideology, it could be a religious belief system, it could just be a moral code of ethics, it doesn't matter. But those exist because they naturally assume the person does not have the ability to experience value intrinsically. Therefore, we must give some kind of guidelines for experiencing value in life, right? Creating value. But what I found is that those value systems are completely irrelevant now. Like whether those values, if somebody's telling me, or you should, this is the right thing to do, or this is the good thing to do. These kind of postulates make no sense anymore because I derive value from my own experience, and I intrinsically know what feels right, what feels wrong, what feels good, what feels bad. I mean, I don't even make those judgments. I just sort of intuitively move forward. But what I'm finding now as I look out into the world, we've always had these value systems, correct? But these value systems have evolved in a manner where they've become very powerful and potent, especially when it comes to the politics that we're experiencing and we're witnessing in North America, Europe, and all of that. And it almost seems like technology, population growth, all these things have caused such rampant alienation in people's lives that if they felt disconnected from their lives before, they're even more so now. They feel it acutely. Depression, anxiety, social anxiety, all of that. And so these value systems have become these gospels of dogma and doctrine that people are grasping onto for dear freaking life because they're so scared of the pace at which the world is changing and the feeling that they're losing control of what's happening around. And I saw something very interesting that you posted a while ago about values and anti-values. And I really liked what you had to say about that. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, so I think what occurred to me in that post is that in today's world, in the modern world, and I'll say for sure the West. I don't know directly too much. I'm going to speak to everywhere in the world, but particularly in the West, people have lost. Like you said, society, for better or worse, has essentially functions by imparting values, traditions, norms, and ideas. And those essentially are adopted by people largely in place of maybe their own direct experience. Maybe some people step outside of that, they develop their own values, their own experiences, but largely society tries to coordinate with those. And so in the past, historically, you had kind of values and norms, which were, let's just say they were more intelligently adapted to the world as it was then, right? Like, the world did not change as quickly like you're talking about. Your life was largely the same as your grandfather's life, and his life was largely the same as, maybe a different king, a different, border, whatever. But farmer, blacksmith. But that's not the case today. Literally decades. Being born in the 70s, you had a complete different experience than someone born in the 90s, and someone born in the 90s different than the 2000s. Rapid change, too fast for society's inherent norms and values to really keep up with that. And so we've had this loss of cultural cohesion. We've had this loss of cohesive values that people share. There have always been political parties. There's always been this side and that side. But in the past, there was more of a core which those people agreed upon and then disagreed at the boundaries, at the tails of that. That's less the case today, massively so. There's very little that is agreed upon on almost all structures. And in its place, we have kind of seen the emergence of something I would call anti-values, where a large segment of the population, they really don't know what they're for. They only know what they're against. They only know that we don't want capitalism, we don't want growth, we don't want oil, we don't want these social issues, we don't want this, we don't want that. Okay, great. So what do you want? How do you want to replace that? And there's some maybe half thought out ideas or a couple things. Well, we just know we need to make everything solar, and that's the fix for everything, and that's our solution. And you dig into it, and there's complexity there, enormous engineering complexity, enormous a lot to discuss, but largely they don't have an answer. Largely They just know what they're against. They don't know what they're for. They don't have a solution. They don't have a system. They don't have something new. And society can't organize around what we don't want, what we're against. That's not how society works. That's not how, I mean, you can have a little bit of that, you know, as a spice here and there, but largely societies constructively organize and create meaning around positive values, just like what we want, what we value, what's good. And I feel that the lack of these positive values, you know, coupled on the rate of change, coupled on, you know, disconnection and mental health, leaves people with very little that gives their life meaning in a traditional sense. You know, there have always been and will always be people that kind of step out of that conditioned bubble, generate their own meaning, their own values. But I think it's important to recognize that most of the world is going to derive their meaning from social values. And I think we're really not able to, you know, in today's culture.
Yeah, and you know, I want to investigate what you think is driving that. I'll give you my thoughts on that, of why people are so anti-value. I'm going to say anti because I'm Canadian and you're going to say anti because you're American, and that's okay. But why they're driven by anti-values as opposed to positive values. And part of my intuition is that it has something to do with our addiction to the rate of change. We have become addicted in a sense to that constant need for change in our environment to feel a sense of progress and to feel a sense of security. And so this is an addiction to novelty. And I've seen this living in Japan, where they need to come out with new products of the same thing at a rapid pace in order to keep the consumer base interested. Otherwise, people just become bored. And when people become bored, they become depressed and listless and anxious. And it's almost become this runaway phenomenon where you need to produce more and more novelty faster and faster to keep people engaged. Otherwise, they begin to feel like they're becoming consumed by, you know, their own lack of direction or lack of meaning and all of that. So it's this very superficial, trivial level of engagement. It's really a form of distraction. And I'm wondering whether that has translated into our value systems, in that we are anti everything that is right now because we want something new. And we're not even 100% sure what that new is. And even if that new thing were to come into being and was the status quo for a little while, people will become anti that very soon, because the rate of change that a human being expects now, and you see this in people's attention spans, right? Whether they're on Twitter or on Facebook or whatever, people just need to be constantly stimulated by things. The posts that go viral the most are not the ones that are lengthy and require you to invest your attention and thought. They're the ones that give you the quick hit of dopamine and help you move on to the next thing. 6 seconds, 10-second stops, move on, move on, move on. It seems like most people are oriented to that kind of shifts in their consciousness. How do you think that ties into what you were saying earlier?
Yeah, I think I think that's an accurate observation of where people are, you know, where a large majority of people are at today. They're constantly seeking that kind of short-term novelty, dopamine, idea, trend. The news has become a constant stream of like, here's the thing to obsess about. Now here's the thing to obsess about. Now here's a new thing. And you know, I think, man, I think there's a wide range of reasons for that, you know, and I'm sure you would agree. It's a lot of factors coming together, and I'm not going to be able to touch on all of them, nor do I probably even understand them. But I think what you're highlighting, and I think part of what underlies that is just tremendous disconnection from our direct experience, and in a new way. I think people are tremendously disconnected. And part of this, I think, goes back to this kind of something I was talking about a little bit of like the rate of change and how societies operated before. I view norms, traditions, and values essentially as a form of like social technology. And they emerge kind of organically through trial and error, what is adaptive, what is non-adaptive, kind of an evolutionary process. There's an intelligence to, I think, norms and traditions which have lasted a long time. It doesn't mean they're true, right? It doesn't, we have observed, there's a study that they did of essentially, it was a tribal society. I think it was in kind of the Philippines area, I'm not sure. But essentially this culture, the maximum size that communities on these islands could get to, I think was like 300 people. And they got larger than that and they started to fall apart because people would fight and be disconnected. And there was this one society, this one kind of tribal group that reached like 2,000 people. And so researchers were like, okay, what allowed them to essentially have cohesion and get that big without suffering the fate of every other group? And what they found is whenever there would be problems, they would come together to pray to the gods. Everyone would be forced to do it. But what that prayer actually looked like was everyone had to get together, and people from opposing kind of sects and parts of society had to team up and dance and sing and chant for days. And essentially, the takeaway here is probably not that those activities were the specific activities that a group of gods needed and then they fixed their problem, but that's what they believed it was about. But what it actually did was bring opposing parts of society together and help them kind of connect and reestablish a baseline. And so this was like a cultural technology. It was like a societal technology that even if people don't know why they're doing it, it has some value. It has some adaptive quality. And I think that's true everywhere. But kind of going back to what we talked about, things have changed too fast. Our adaptive social technologies no longer apply to the world as it is today. And so people are kind of, they're very against traditional norms. And okay, I can understand that in some ways because, you know, I'm not painting with a broad brush here because I think there is still a lot of value in a lot of things, but some of them have become non-adaptive. They don't apply to the world as it is today. And this is driven disconnection. This is driven pessimism. People feel that like, okay, the stuff I'm told to do doesn't work. And, you know, generally people aren't going to, you know, kind of effectively navigate that. So they feel disconnected. But on top of that, I think another thing is we have become, especially in the West, a profoundly unserious society. We have become a culture of irony where it is largely, I think it's largely looked down upon to be a serious person. You can see this even in the way that like the FBI Twitter account posts these like frivolous things. This is a very serious institution for our nation. And you know, it is essentially this modern or postmodern sense of irony where it is out of vogue, I think, to be seriously committed to the hard work of trying to build civilization. So those are kind of two different things. I see them as playing a role, but it's the failure of our social technologies. It is the, you know, essentially the surplus that essentially our ancestors and essentially the people that came before us, the incredible prosperity that we have inherited has created a culture that is profoundly unconcerned with the serious questions of civilization.
And that's an interesting point you make because, you know, I'm sure a lot of people would consider themselves very serious and serious to the point, and you can see this on Facebook, on social media. Man, when people argue points, they argued with every ounce of emotion in their body, like they so care about these things. And these phenomenons of, you know, like slacktivism and social justice warriors and all of that, people seem to be taking what they believe very, very seriously. And yet I get what you mean about the lack of seriousness is that when everything becomes equally serious, then the whole thing becomes a joke because everything becomes an urgent issue. It's like being at work, and when every email you send your boss, regardless of how serious the issue is, has an urgent sort of, flag on it, no one's going to take your email seriously anymore because they're like, okay, he's just crying wolf at this point. And I also think, what the information age has done is it's put everybody on a level playing field, to the extent that it's kind of reduced people to the lowest common denominator. You see this happen a lot with like media agencies, for example, whereas back in the day, like I remember my grandfather, every morning was his newspaper reading time. And this was a very serious time in the family, right? 7 a.m., my grandfather woke up, he brought his cup of tea and he sat on the balcony and he opened up the newspaper and he spent an hour reading the newspaper, and everybody knew reading the news is an important and serious time of day. And then the other time you heard the news was maybe in the evening before you went to bed for 30 minutes when you heard the headlines on TV, and that was it. 2 times. And these newspaper agencies were well respected because they were doing some hard-hitting journalism. They were sending reporters out there, and that was the only channel of information we had to receive, current affairs in the world. But now it's turned into this free-for-all on the internet, where everybody has equal access to the consumer. The CNN or Global News or whatever has equal access to any blog out there, and so they start dropping their standards in order to compete with the rabble, with whoever else is out there. And that's why we've seen headlines in the news transform from very serious sounding headlines to pure and utter clickbait. Like, I look at a headline and be like, look what this leader recently said about the Ukraine crisis. And I'm like, why don't you tell me what he said in the headline instead of making me click to see what he said? It's so kind of, it seems to have lost the intent of what journalism was supposed to be about, and has become about retaining customers. And you see that again with, like you said, the FBI Twitter account, the FDA Twitter account, presidents using Twitter accounts. Suddenly they're on the same level playing field as your buddy who's tweeting something else about the meal he ate. And when that happens, how people value things goes completely awry, right? It becomes chaotic. And then people need to be told how to value things. And so we don't have that kind of clear hierarchy of information, of how serious certain issues are as opposed to others. So everything just becomes a serious issue.
Absolutely. And, it's in this kind of marketplace of news, you effectively have everything gets reduced to what is going to drive the most revenue and the most clicks. And like you said, it's not long form, nuanced articles that people are going to spend 20 minutes reading. But and this is kind of what I mean by seriousness, because I agree, people think they're very serious, but and from a certain definition of that word, okay, they are. But to properly address a subject, almost any subject that matters, it requires tremendous nuance. There are costs and benefits to the issues that we're all talking about, issues of energy, issues of geopolitics, issues of money. There is no simple answer. There is no answer that doesn't carry tremendous costs and benefits. And there's absolutely no way to properly address that question. In these kind of short formats, in these easy, painless, and ultimately ideological. Ideology has essentially become the lens through which people relate to ideas. New information comes in, or something someone said, or something they read, and I'm not saying this hasn't probably always been the case, but it literally just gets run through the filter of ideology. Does this sound like something this type of person would say, or is this something this other type of person would say? Where they're essentially filtering and sorting the information instead of actually addressing, like, okay, maybe this sounds like something that normally people on the right are concerned with, or people on the left are concerned with, but is there a point? Is there any new information here? Is this a valuable perspective? And we see this just tremendously. I mean, one of the issues I'm very passionate about is energy production. And, you know, I consider myself an armchair, an armchair energy speculator. But, you know, we live in a world where there's tremendously bright people that you can access their information and really learn an incredible amount. But I think we have pursued feel good energy options, things which make people sound good or good for short-term political cycles. And as we've seen with with Russia and Ukraine, we have tremendous problems when energy is disrupted. It is the master resource of society, and our discussion, our collective discussion as a group, should be incredibly nuanced, should be incredibly serious, any undertaking to reimagine our energy system. But that's not what we see. We see kind of very quick and very ideological discussions. And, you can see that in most areas. That's just one that I particularly pay attention to.
Yeah, and the nuanced discussion would almost be like the cherry on the cake. It's almost like people don't even want to engage in discussion. It seems like every social issue is a foregone conclusion in people's minds, not even worth discussing. And this is true of the right and the left. I mean, you see it on both sides. So, I'm not pointing fingers at any, one group or proponent of any one ideology. It's just a social phenomenon that we're witnessing all the time. And this is something, I highlight even in the spiritual industry. There are these parallels between what we're seeing in society at large and what has been occurring in the spiritual industry for a very long time. In fact, I would say society at large seems to be going the way that the spiritual industry has been going for decades and centuries, is this move towards the feel-good aspect. And more and more dogmatic ideologies and a complete ignorance of facts and an unwillingness to delve deeper, to want to settle for quick, easy conclusions and the immediate gratification that brings, right? And it seems like exactly that. Nuanced discussion can only happen when a person has already accepted that there's no simple answer to any dilemma in life, that there is going to be a trade-off in any scenario, on any solution you come up with. There's going to be some benefits and some costs involved. There's going to be some risks involved, and it's going to impact somebody negatively. If you don't allow for that option, if you're not willing to consider that there will be people hurt by even the best solutions you can come up with, then that's when you're living in denial. And I feel like a lot of people are, because especially around a lot of the social issues we've been seeing unfold over the last 10 years in the West, but also in parts of Asia and in Europe, is that you're seeing this complete lack of ability for people to admit that, yes, there will be people negatively affected by what we want to happen. So there seems to be a lack of empathy, a lack of compassion, a lack of willingness, a lack of openness. And when you have that, you start seeing that people's thinking becomes more and more rigid and focused on more increasingly unrealistic, naive, and ideological outcomes, which have very little to do with reality, right? So I'm looking at your background there, and what's that blue tapestry up on the right? Is that like a Buddhist thing there?
Yeah, it's a Tibetan deity. The deity's name is Zambala, and he's actually the Tibetan deity of money.
Okay.
Actually, yeah. So he's.
Yeah, it's interesting because you've got the Buddhist thing happening there, and then you've got the Bitcoin symbol at the bottom, and it's this. It's an interesting dichotomy that you've brought into your life of the spiritual and the material. And it seems like regardless of which way you approach life, whether from purely materialistic lens or you come at it from a spiritual lens, the same lesson has to be learned.
Absolutely.
And that's a lesson
Absolutely.
of like dark and light, that there's a shadow side to every benefit you can think of, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I agree that it is, it is these kind of same lessons that, are applicable in both areas. And, I mean, I really see it as these areas, the material and everything and the worldly issues and the spiritual. I mean, they're completely and utterly compatible. And actually, I would say enhance each other. I would say actually, like if you're solely oriented in one direction, you've essentially split your life in two, because that's not reality. Like what's reality is that you are a human being with a human life with worldly concerns, and cause and effect and certain dynamics there. And there's also this spiritual dimension. There's also this awareness. And if you lack, you know access, integration, knowledge of either one, like you're going to be limited. Either you're going to be kind of the way a lot of people are in society, of just like purely materialistic, and just kind of going through very, very, very disconnected, largely, divorced from a lot of meaning and other things. Or you end up like a lot of people in the spiritual community, where you become fairly, escapism, you become disconnected, you become essentially running away from the world and convincing yourself that it doesn't matter, it isn't real, it's an illusion. And look, that's what Ramana said. And if Ramana said it's an illusion, then it must be an illusion. And that's not the whole story. And I don't even believe that he believed that. I think it's a selective interpretation. But it's this lack of integration, and it's this lack of, I think our value needs to come to reality, of kind of this worship of reality. And what I mean there is, whether we're in our worldly life, our business role, our work, our spiritual life, our meditation practice, our concern should be, how is, how, what is reality actually like? What is actually happening here? What is the reality of this circumstance? What is the reality of my life? Not what do I want it to be, or what did someone tell me, or what does this ideology say it should be and how I should interpret it. But if I directly observe my lived experience, my existential experience from a spiritual perspective, or the actual reality of this problem I'm trying to solve in my career, of whatever it is, of what is that actually like? What is true, as opposed to what do I want it to be? What would I prefer it to be? And it's, you said something before about nuance only being possible when you acknowledge that there are trade-offs, that there is costs to any decision. And I would argue also that nuance is only possible if you consider the fact that you may be wrong, and that like the way you currently view it is not full or correct, and that you need to maintain an openness to essentially your view being proven limited or incorrect. And the only way you can do that is if you actually give a shit about what is true. You have to put what is true above everything else. And I think that's a great orientation for life, no matter what your concerns are. If you want to make money in the stock market, or you want to get enlightened, either one of those, you want to put what is true first, so you don't go bankrupt, or so you actually have any degree of success.
And I think a lot of people are convinced they're motivated by what is true when they're actually motivated by what feels good.
Yeah.
And that's because sometimes the truth hurts. In fact, most of the times, the truth hurts initially when you first encounter it, right? Because truth is not designed to make any allowances for whatever it is you're going through. Truth is just going to smack you in the face with what is reality of the situation. And it's up to you to be able to adapt to that reality and thrive within that reality, or have to suffer not being able to do that, right? Most people have an inertia to adaptation. They're too entrenched in their own ideas of themselves and ideas of what they believe. And those ideas actually become the obstacle, preventing themselves from adapting, because what values one circumstance needs might be completely different from what another one needs, but your ideologies are not adaptive in that way. They're kind of set in stone. And so we might find certain scenarios in which, yes, it all fits in very perfectly with my idea of what I want life to be. And that's why spiritual people, for example, will seek spiritual communities, or people, will seek similar friends, or married people will seek to hang out with married people. So their own life choices are being reflected back to them and validated as being the right ones. But often when chaos strikes, or when the status quo suddenly shifts and you're faced with realities that look very different from the one you've been sort of planning your life around, people are completely unable to adapt, because they're like, well, but now I'm divorced, so does that mean I can hang out with my married friends? Or now I'm broke, so with my friends who have jobs still want to hang out with me? Or now I question that spiritual teacher, so does that mean I'm still part of the community? Like this, your whole life setup is dependent on the identity that you've created for yourself. Why I believe in society at large today, we're seeing people becoming so entrenched in their belief systems, is because that status quo is shifting at like this rapid pace. It's shifting very quickly. Like you said, our social technology, and it's interesting, and I like the fact that you use the word social technology to describe our traditions and values, all of that. Our social technology is not able to keep up with our actual technology and our technological advancements. And so the fabric of reality is itself changing so fast. And I wonder what you think about, does that then become the fertile ground for an existential crisis to happen on a mass scale, right? Because, I mean, I think what we're seeing manifesting here is the beginnings of a giant existential crisis in humanity itself.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think we're, and I'll preface this with, there are people that spend their whole career predicting a crisis, right? In almost it's just right around the corner, and I'm not one of those people. Even, I've been in, anyways. So I just say that to say, I'm not the person that's always going to be predicting some big exponential crisis or change, but I do think we are really at a point where we are coming up against tremendous change on, all levels. I mean, really from our social reality to, or even like global currency dynamics, this Russia thing. I mean, it is a paradigm shift that I can't understate how big it is that Europe and the US said to the Russian central bank, oh, your money's no good. We're deleting those dollars, those euros, they're worth zero. Like that is a total shift of essentially the monetary system of the last 70 years. But I'm not going to go off on a tangent on that, but a huge change there, huge change geopolitically, huge change on, during this last period of time, the White House, the US is calling up OPEC, they're calling up Saudi Arabia saying, hey, get us more oil. And they wouldn't take the call. When is the last time nations ignored the overtures of the US, right? That's different, right? That's different. So that's one dimension of life. There's our social, our cultural dimension that we've been talking about, technology, and where people are at psychologically. And I think this is exactly the fertile ground for an existential crisis. I think I wholeheartedly, or at least for the most part, believe that if you kind of just go through your life just blindly believing what you're told in this minute, you're going to have a really bad time. you're going to have a bad time on almost all of the levels, like from what you eat to what you buy to how you live to what you value. And that wasn't always the case. It's not just this blind, like, society is bad and, you know, we all have to be individuals. Like, you know, rewind the clock a couple thousand years, and it's not that everything we did was right, but like, if you just like largely believed the conditioning, it was more practically functional, I'll say. It was more practical. It's not to say it's perfect and there weren't, you know, injustices and all that, but it was more practically functional, you know? And that is not the case. I mean, that is not the case. And I don't think we've ever seen a society where just the circumstances, the change, the conditioning was just so kind of maladaptive, just set you up for just issues in a sense. So I think this is fertile ground for an existential crisis. I think, you know, and I think there can be a silver lining in that, you know, even if you look at the history of the United States, there's a great generational historian who charts this. And basically, once in every 80 years, like one long human life, the US has gone through a growth, you know, a really strong time, a stagnation, a decline, and a crisis. And these crises become cyclical, at least, you know, in you know, the US is obviously a younger country. It moves kind of quicker, but these crises are part of it. And we've seen crises, you know, carry a lot of silver linings in the past. So I think on many levels, we're coming up at least against a much higher probability of that than ever before. But I hope that that might shake some things loose. That could be good.
So where do you think it's all heading in terms of what does that silver lining look like in your mind? Because from where I see it, I find a lot of people who are seeing this phenomenon unfold the way you and I are talking about it and the way you and I are seeing it, the people who are capable of some level of nuance in their thought, in their speech, in their action, not seeing, you know, the unfolding of these events from a black and white perspective, but more from a place of concern that, hey, this is all starting to go a little bit haywire and nobody's in charge seems to have any control over it. They're just kind of all reacting rather than being proactive and having a strategy or a plan. And I find a lot of those people are saying they want to try and do it their own way now. And so they're kind of moving outwards away from the hub of where social change and all of that happens to the outskirts, onto the fringes, and starting to build their own small bubbles and communities, slowing their lives down, getting back to the basics in a lot of ways, with work, with finance, with relationships, with community, recognizing that this thing that we call a global community has kind of become monstrous in a way, and we've lost all control of it. Technology has exacerbated and accelerated some of that. And that if we want to live with some semblance of sanity, then we have to decentralize. Somehow, most of these systems we've kind of become the pillars of society, like healthcare, like finance, like you know, governance, and all of that. We need to look into decentralizing, not in any political way, but more in a practical way in their own lives. Wondering what your thoughts are on that, with the silver lining of the situation.
Yeah. So I think the silver lining is we're in a collision course with reality, period. Like, you can only fight reality for so long before the impacts of your decisions and processes come to affect you. I would largely say that we have been living off the prosperity and abundance of generations that came before us, that were very practically oriented and built out essentially the industrial and social capacity for these wonderful lives we all led, these wonderful air-conditioned, food-abundant lives. We have a tremendous energy, very, very prosperous amounts of energy. But that doesn't come from nowhere. That comes from infrastructure. That comes from undertaking. That comes from primarily the investment of human intellectual capital, human time, and human financial capital into all the things that make our world run. And previous generations were very concerned with that. They primarily wanted to advance the material well-being of culture. And we are not very concerned with that, largely. Our concerns have become otherwise, and we've been essentially coasting off the prosperity that was handed down to us. And the problem is there's only so much buffer. There's only so much buffer. And no matter how strong the system is on a practical functional level, if we mismanage it fundamentally, if we're on a collision course with reality, eventually those impacts start to show itself. The gas price becomes very high, the food is more expensive, all of these various things. We're not innovating. I'm actually very against the notion that we are in like the most rapid period of technical innovation we've ever seen. I think if you look at it, like the 1900s through the 1950s, the rate of change there was absolutely phenomenal. Everything in our houses, most of it, except for these computers, was invented then. Air conditioning and refrigeration and industrial things. So we've essentially kind of stepped back from that, where we're running off these, the prosperity that was built, and we've had other concerns and we've made choices. They're putting us on a collision course with reality. The good thing about reality is it will assert itself. And when it does, we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity because I don't believe, like, if we actually run into these issues, food, energy, these very fundamental building blocks, if we hit a shortage of that, like, the reality is, like, people will share whatever ideology they want, but when their gas is $10, like, they're going to be concerned about getting the gas price down. That's an example. But so I think as we hit this collision course, and this is not just the material level, this is the social fabric, where we're in tumultuous times. There's very little cohesion. Something that frustrates me is that there's no talk of compromise today. You don't see that the various sides of the aisle saying, okay, this is what these people value, this is what we value. I don't really mind that they want this to be this way in schools or that, so let's compromise, let's give and take. So, social, material, all these different levels, we're running into a collision course. And I believe fundamentally in the adaptiveness and intelligence of human beings. I do. I mean, I think we are an incredible species. I think there's so much to be proud of. I think that it's in vogue to be pessimistic and think humans are bad and we're destroying everything, at least in a certain segment. But I think we're incredibly adaptive. And I think as these real problems come to face, as we face actual limits on our way of living and our society, that people will rise, adapt, and change. And so that's the silver lining. I think we can't really we can't really extend the sort of decision making that we've been using too much longer. And we'll have to kind of start to have a more pragmatic approach to all of these various questions. And I don't think we're too far from that.
I like that phrase, collision course with reality, because I mean, that's the kind of thing I like. I'd like to be on a collision course with reality, yeah. But most people are of the opposite mindset, right? Because they've basically orchestrated their whole lives trying to avoid reality. Yeah. Without knowing it subconsciously, but that's the way it's been set up. But it also seems to me that the world is sensing that this collision course is happening, that they're on this course. And when people are in that mode, when they feel that things are getting out of control, they tend to hold on tight, right? Like it's like a car careening out of control. You start gripping more tightly. It seems almost like the window of opportunity for any nuanced conversation has long gone, right? Like we're just not seeing it. And the few channels in which that nuanced conversation is happening whether that be on somebody's Substack or whether that be on somebody's podcast, those channels, as nuanced as they're trying to be, are being vilified and are being called anti-establishment, not because they're actually being contrarian. In fact, many of them are not being contrarian at all. They're trying to have, like you said, a nuanced discussion, consider all points of view, but they're being called anti-establishment because they're considering all points of view and not the point of view that the establishment has. I think what's happening is a lot of people are becoming very disillusioned with this and realizing that they have very little control or ability to influence any of this. And I've seen this happen in my own writing. Is I've seen how the one platform that I use most often, Facebook, I mean, the algorithms are designed to shut me down the moment I start even expressing any kind of, a viewpoint that deviates from the narrative. I can immediately see the impacts on how my voice becomes suppressed. And if me, who's really a relative nobody in the space, experiences this, I can't imagine what the impact then is on people who are more vocal, more public, and are trying to reach out to people. So it seems like not only are there fewer nuanced voices, but the odds are stacked against them for their voices to even be heard.
Yeah. And I think there is this tension today between essentially making sure people believe the right thing, and you only say the right thing as defined by, well, that's the question, who defines that? That's very much the case, I think, especially with technology. And yet, these, I would say let's just say these channels where there is the most controversy are tremendously popular. I mean, I think we could all agree that, Joe Rogan's podcast falls under this category of like kind of contrarian, there's a tension around it. It's the most popular podcast in the world. So yes, there are these kind of influences. There are these kind of, censorship and ideological censorship and all of these things. And yet the people that are essentially stepping out of that box are some of the most popular figures, which to me expresses there's like a very kind of breath of fresh air demand. Like people want this sort of conversation that, that breaks these boundaries. And I think that's essential. And you don't have to agree with everything that, just to, use Joe Rogan's podcast as an example. You don't have to agree with every guest that comes on there or everything that every guest says. You don't have to agree with any of it, like to, agree that like they should have the right to, have that discussion, that people should have the right to explore and discuss ideas. And, I think there's a dangerous precedent, where we equate the mere discussion of an idea with like the full weight of impact of all the potential implications of that idea, right? Like, and I think that becomes like, I can understand kind of the mental gymnastics one can undertake to get there, but it becomes essentially a tool for authoritarianism in a sense, where you create a society where like essentially a given stance can be set, and then there can be no discussion or no discussion of that stance. And like if we take that through the lens of science, right, like that's anti-science. That's like literally like the essence of modern science is doubt. Doubt is the beating heart of science. Like science only advances ever because you have an established norm and somebody or some group of people comes along and essentially questions that norm, turns up evidence to support the opposing point of view, and over a period of time overturns that norm. Now, what happens to our world? What happens to our science? Let's just say stick on science. What happens to science if you can no longer question the established, just take every established point of view we have today and say no questioning? society progress stops, or we completely stop. So doubt, discussion, critique, these are the essential building blocks of moving society forward. And if when we try to stop that, I think we're really damaging the social fabric. But I think the silver lining there is that I think people really do want these sort of dialogues. I don't think very many people honestly prefer some of this other stuff, in a sense of just, they don't actually want to live in a society where like all discussion is essentially centrally mandated as approved or not approved. Like, I think they don't realize how dangerously close we've gotten. I think they don't see it as getting there. And maybe, maybe it involves us going too far for them to realize that. I don't know, but I don't think people really want that.
Yeah, I don't think most people really want that either. I think most people have been convinced that that's a nice to have, except when the world is in crisis.
Yeah.
And I think most people are of the mindset that, yeah, when things are in a critical state, then, there's no time for that discussion. Then we have to defer to people who have authority in such matters. Then it just becomes a question of manufacturing the next crisis to coincide with the ending of the previous one. And if you can keep the world in a state of constant crisis, then there's never an opportunity for discussion to emerge. And at a certain point, people just accept that that's the new reality, that's the new normal, right? And I see this happening a lot with, politics of identity, for example. And I really think the politicization of things like identity, things like science, is what has diluted the seriousness of these issues, to be honest with you. Because it's not science that's a problem. In fact, science, like you said, is the solution to most of our, our crises that we experience in civilization today. But it's more the politicization of these areas of life that then restricts our ability to truly engage with it. And take the word racist, for example, right? And as a person who comes from a visible minority group, I mean, I've never really thought of myself that way, but that's how I would be identified in Western society today, as somebody of a visible minority. And I've grown up and I've lived in different parts of the world. I've lived, grown up in India, I've lived in the Middle East, I've lived in Japan and Asia. I've experienced like actual racism, like severe racism, the kind where, you're getting, there's violence or aggression towards you by virtue of the fact that you are the color of the skin that you are, right? And so what I now see in society living here in Canada, where I feel like this is one of the most egalitarian societies that have ever existed in the history of humankind. And the way that word racist gets tossed around, it offends me as someone of color that people use that word as frequently as they do, and for as slight a reason as they do, prompted on almost nothing. And because it dilutes the seriousness of what it means to be a racist. If somebody actually like lynching, people lynching somebody in public is now the same as somebody who maybe doesn't, uses a word that you don't deem appropriate. If those two people are on the same level, then like I said, it's kind of like that crying wolf phenomenon where you're flagging everything as an urgent crisis. And in Canada, our own PM uses words like racist and bigot and misogynist left, right, and center as if it's, it's going to go out of style if he doesn't do it. And that comes down to the politicization of the issue. And that's what I see happening with science as well. People are using the science as this tag to just chuck at other people and knock them senseless as if they truly understand it themselves. And you don't actually see true, like, salt of the earth scientists doing any of this shit. It's politics, it's news agencies, and it's your general public on social media doing that kind of stuff. And so, it circles back to exactly what you were saying before. We've become unserious because we take things so seriously. We take offense so seriously. We've become hypersensitive. to everything that doesn't completely act in accord with how we view the world.
Absolutely. The concept of the science does not exist. There is no such thing. That's a fundamental misunderstanding of what science is. There is no settled science. Even gravity is still a theory, right? We lack the certainty even in our most established scientific norms, let alone the sorts of things that, like, it's that people are throwing out, like this notion, I think, is incredibly toxic of not questioning the science. And that doesn't mean that all points of views are equally valid. And that doesn't mean that everyone that pushes back against that, like that whatever view they have on vaccines or the given disease, or that they're all equally valid. Of course, it's not relativism, but it's but there is no such thing as the science. And therefore, we are essentially suppressing intelligent discourse and scientific inquiry, with this approach, because it is like I said, it's doubt, it's questioning. That's what advances science. Doesn't mean that everybody that doubts, there's flat earth people in the world. It doesn't mean that all doubt is equal. Like some doubt is intelligent, other doubt, maybe not so much. But the doubt is essential. And, it's just so incredibly important that we are able to open up these channels and kind of end some of the because it has become politicized, like you said. It's become essentially weaponized and politicized, and we've lost touch with what the really the core values of science and of these dialogues are. And they've been replaced with ideological tools, and it's a difficult state of affairs. And we opt for people have replaced largely reason with ideology, and they don't know that they've done so. They don't know that they have swapped those two out. And you can see you can see this. There's so many examples, and there's this huge breakdown with media reporting of science and media representation of science. You can see this literally, even if we stay completely rooted in what, let's say, the IPCC report. This is the big intergovernmental panel on climate change. They come out with a report every so often. Let's say we only stick to what is in that report. Even just as far as that report goes, and if we assume every conclusion in there is 100% accurate, the media representation is insane. I mean, it doesn't even match in a lot of ways what's in the document. And it's the state of science reporting in almost every field that has become very poor, and it's rooted in this notion called persuade, don't inform. And you have this kind of decision that scientists and politicians and governments made that we need to report various, it started with climate, and I think it's moved to most things. It's moved to the broad state of science reporting. And it's persuade, don't inform. And it's saying, we're not really going to present all the nuance. We're not going to really represent the science accurately with all of its uncertainties, with all of its ambiguities, of which there always are tremendous, tremendous ambiguities and uncertainties. We're going to try to persuade people. We're just going to try to put out information that gets people to take whatever action we deem is kind of appropriate given the state of this research. The problem with that is even if the research is 100% bulletproof, which it never is, even if the research was right, how do you know that your given set of policy recommendations and actions are the right actions to take? Even if the research is right, which it's not going to be all the time, who decides what we do about it, you know? And when we don't seek to educate and inform people, and we just seek to shove and persuade, you know, I think the actions we take as a society become largely decided by a very small group of people that hopefully is acting in our best interests and are highly intelligent. But maybe we don't want to rely on that. Maybe we don't want to count that the entire direction we take as a civilization is decided in back rooms.
Yeah, and it's this phrase, persuade, don't inform. It's something that I've been critiquing about the spiritual industry, because that's been their MO from the get-go, right? They've always operated that way. Spiritual teachers are not interested in discussion, generally speaking. You know, there are always exceptions to the rule, but the culture has set it up in such a way that there's a one directional dissemination of knowledge, wisdom, and information. There's an assumption that the seekers don't know, don't have the capacity to know, don't have the capacity to understand. Is the teachers who are the knowers, who have the capacity to understand what this reality is. And they're going to now teach, they're going to disseminate that wisdom to the seekers, and the seekers must accept and follow along compliantly. And that's turned into aberrations, these cults of personality over time, and this culture that doesn't really, that appears on the surface to promote inquiry and investigation, but doesn't really at all. It promotes compliance and blind, you know, belief and acceptance of things that they're being told. And it seems like that's the way general society seems to be heading, in a very similar direction, right? And so it raises the specter of, you know, people in society having that same daft look on their faces that people at a California satsang will have. You know, there's just this fawning, believing, complete naivety, a lack of grounding in reality and the darker, harsher aspects of life, and the courage to be able to engage with life and take responsibility for those aspects of life. So it's so interesting for me that you come from both backgrounds, and are able to bring this insight of what you're seeing unfold in the social reality around you, and you still have some context and connection to what happens in the spiritual world, and that we've discussed a lot of these similarities between these two phenomenon, right? And I think in our own ways we both question, or encourage people to question this kind of status quo.
Yeah. In the spiritual community, I think one of the things that I find the most irresponsible is there are largely these let's call them like teacher-led groups, and they take various forms, but let's just say these are groups where there's like one primary figure, modern figure, that essentially writes the books, gives the retreats, all these sorts of things, right? And it's basically just this one person. It's not a church. It's not it's not an organization. So, I would say in those situations, that individual is largely responsible, or at least carries responsibility for their community. Even if they don't say, I'm not a guru, I'm not this or that, when there's a Facebook page with 30,000 people following this, one person, like you must recognize that you are putting a message out there that a large number of people are imbibing, that are absorbing. And if you go into these groups, most of the time, there's so many of them. And largely, I mean, a lot of these teachers are people I respect. I mean, they're people that have, had a positive impact on my life. It's not that these are, that I'm saying they're just complete charlatans or anything. But if you go into these groups, there are these persistent myths. Awakening will fix all of my problems. An awakened person is totally free from desire and emotions and all of these things. Like, awakening is the end all be all final spiritual achievement. And after that, everything is is all good. Awakening, will fix my psychological issues. There's no need for therapy or any management of those, etc. Those are some of the popular ones, right? These are really, really tenacious myths. Like tons of people believe them. Tons of seekers are just like, we talked about this at the beginning, like awakening, the spiritual search is the get out of jail free card of life. Like this is going to get me free. They think it's going to get them out of all of this stuff. I think it's irresponsible that these teachers that have so much control over their messaging don't literally have like a fact sheet, like an email that they send out. 5 myths about awakening. It won't get you out of this stuff. You will not transcend your emotions. This will not solve all your problems. Like literally just say it in plain words, and repeatedly. If you see this in your community and you see people being terribly misled, okay, by their own beliefs, sure, whatever. But like you are the figure that they are looking up to. Like you need to put this messaging out there to have a modicum of responsibility. It's so easy. Send out an email list. Like it's not hard. Like, they know this, they know these things. I don't believe that they believe, this stuff, but they allow this myth. It supports and I'm not going to say every single person, this is what they're doing, but it's a convenient myth when people believe it. It sells a lot of books. It sells a lot of retreats. I think it's just so important to communicate that plainly, consistently, and clearly. And yeah, if you listen to every recording of this teacher, there's this one retreat where they said, awakening won't fix your problems. And then there's this other retreat where they said, yeah, I still have desires and emotions. But it's not accessible. They don't hear it. They didn't listen to that episode. They didn't read that one line in that one book. They bury it. They don't make it clear and central. And it should be, because if I'm a teacher and I'm looking at my community, the people that are coming to me to help guide them, and I see that they go off in this batshit direction, I want to clarify that. That's what I would want to do. I would want to clarify that. And I don't know why they don't. I don't know why they don't loud and clear.
I honestly could not agree with you more about any of that. And to be honest with you, that's why my page exists. And this is why I write, because teachers are not bringing up that fact sheet, because they're not. Clear disclaimer at the beginning of every satsang: don't misunderstand what this is about. Yeah. These are the dangers and pitfalls. These are the common misunderstandings. This is the kind of shit that'll make you go off on a
waste 30 years of your life.
30 years of your life.
30 years.
And I can fix that right now as a teacher, correct that misconception by just tweaking it slightly. Yeah. And yet I withhold, because I know that if I did that, it might compromise my ability to retain you as a student in the long run, all of that. That's that dishonesty that just drives me fucking mental. Yeah. I don't understand the hypocrisy of wanting to speak truth and then yet withholding what absolutely matters. Yeah. And I've gone on, this podcast with a number of teachers, and they're all great people. And I've connected, in the background through text and private messaging with a number of teachers. And they all seem like perfectly ordinary, fine individuals. And they say, oh yeah, well, we don't call ourselves teachers, or we make it very clear that I say, yes, I know you do, but the overall vibe that you get when you read your stuff is not what you're saying at all. Yeah. The overall vibe is one of, there is that thing that I can arrive at. That's the overall vibe. I'm sorry, but it is. And how do you correct that? By recognizing that there's centuries of bias pre-built and programmed into this damn industry, that you literally have to spell it out over and over and over again to your followers until they get it. that A, you're not more special than they are. You're not going to be happier than they are. You have same kinds of issues that they have. You struggle financially like they do. You have emotional issues that you have. There are things that your mom or dad said to you when you were a child you still haven't resolved. But you're a normal human being. That's it. And they won't say it. They won't say it like that. They'll say it in a spiritual way that still gives them that little bit of an edge that, they'll say, oh, I've come off my pedestal. No, you just took one step down.
Yeah.
Your pedestal was 10 feet high. Now it's 5 feet high. Or you're still an inch off the ground. You're still walking an inch off the ground higher than everybody else's. And the unwillingness to come all the way back down to the level of where their followers are and talk person to person in the eye as equals is something that, just is a rare thing. And I share your frustration with that. And looks like you feel, just as passionately as I do about it.
Yeah, I'm grateful. I mean, I could have just as easily spent 30 years of my life barking up the wrong tree. I'm grateful, every day that I didn't, and I see countless people just that generally arrive nowhere, right? They just kind of stay in this kind of confused, a very like the specific seeking angle, looking for escape, looking for a way out, their whole lives, right? And I think we've been very kind of clear and focused on all the things that it isn't. And it's because those things aren't said, they're not communicated, they're not stated plainly and repetitively. I mean, God, how many times do you have to say that? I don't even say this as a critique, but you will see teachers make the same points over and over and over again. And it's there's value in that. I'm not critiquing that, but to the same extent that you do that, you also need to clarify these points. It will viscerally impact the way people engage. And so, we've been very clear on that because it's unsaid, it's not stated plainly. And yet it's also a disservice to there is something of value here. There is something transformative and beautiful and profound in all of this. My experience is as much as, in the beginning I said caveat, there's a paradoxical caveat. As much as literally nothing changed, my experience is totally transformed from where it was when I was 16, right? My literal visceral experience of reality was irrevocably changed in a profound way. No, it's not that anything changed. It's not that any element of my humanity was rendered into light or anything, right? But yet there is this thing, and there is this profound beauty and necessity to it, right? My life is very different, despite how I will constantly say that nothing changed. It's a paradox. It's confusing to talk about and understand, and I appreciate the complexity in trying to communicate that. But I think it even does a disservice not clearly stating the limitations and pitfalls of this whole thing. Even does a disservice to the positive and real sides to this whole process. The reason that any of us even get into any of this, or why people have done it for thousands of years.
Yeah, in a past podcast with Luke Jordan, we were talking about how a lot of people label me anti-spiritual, right? Because I seem so against the culture and all of that. But that's because I find the culture has become a caricature, right? It's that same phenomenon that you were alluding to before about, our social reality has become so unserious. Is that spiritual culture has become so unserious about what spirituality truly is. When I think about what got me seeking, it was like this powerful impulse to know truth. And It was the most serious thing in the world.
Yes.
There's nothing light and fluffy about it. There was nothing like
life and death.
Life and death. It's like
life and death.
Critical to know, right? It had nothing to do with what you're wearing, who you're hanging out with, how many, even what you're feeling, what emotions you feel, how happy you are. It had nothing to do with it. It had to do with getting to know something vital that I feel I knew, but I've lost. It's like I've developed
Yeah.
Alzheimer's about it, and I
Yeah.
just need to know it again. And then I look at this culture, and it's absolutely the opposite of that level of that kind of get down, raw, real, and dirty. Instead, it's all this fluffy ideological bullshit that it's turned into. And when I'm anti something, I'm anti that. I'm anti that cultural phenomenon that has actually completely distracted people from that meat and bones of spirituality, which is really about exactly what you and I have discussed, becoming fully intimate and inhabiting our own realities, regardless of context, regardless of what emotional upheaval, like none of the context matters.
Exactly.
It doesn't matter if you're depressed. That's
Yeah.
perfectly fine. Being depressed is fine, suffering is fine, all of that's fine. But the spirituality that culture seems to put forward is all about context. Right? You must
Yes.
be a happy self, not a sad self. You must not be suffering. You must be liberated. You must be equanimous, not angry. All of this shit is all about context. And in between, they'll throw in platitudes like, oh, there is no self. That's meaningless, absolutely meaningless. It's just hollow ideology, right?
Yeah. And everyone takes that to mean there is your personality disappears, or your sense of being a person, just like your personality totally vanishes. And it's a, we have a definitions problem. I mean, spiritual teacher communities both are tremendously unprecise with language. They people do not mean the same thing. People use these very vague terms interchangeably. We have a massive definition problem where nobody ever sits down, no one sits down, Adi Ashanti, and says, okay, can you please lay out, like, and I'm picking on him, but precisely what you mean by no self. What actually is happening in your experience? Because something I'm very passionate about is it's difficult. I get that it's difficult to talk about what actually changes experientially. It's subtle, it's paradoxical, but like, why are we here if not to attempt to do that in a clear and valuable way, right? And the thing is like, ego, there's 100 different every teacher has a different definition of what ego is, of what self is, of what that's not a strong basis for discussion. That's not a strong basis for discourse. And like, say what the hell you will, this is about experience. I agree it's about experience. I agree this isn't about language. This isn't about ideas, but that's how we communicate as human beings. Like, unless you're like taking this like radical stance that like, I don't know, it's all transmission. You just like sit in the presence of the person and absorb, which I don't believe. Then there is a communication component involved. And, at the very least, if it doesn't have the capacity to, like, if mental understanding and clarity doesn't have the capacity to get somebody there, I think that's a valid argument one can make. It certainly has the capacity to mislead somebody. It certainly has the capacity to get somebody lost. And I would want to see a tremendous push for clarity of language, for common defined definitions of words. And let's rise to this challenge of talking about these subtle layers of experience. I get that it's hard, but what else do we, that's what we're here to do. If you want to be part of the spiritual community, you want to spend all day talking about this, like, let's strive to actually look at experience and start to tease out an accurate way to talk about it. And yeah, I get it's somewhat subjective. It's hard. It's not like a tree. Oh, tree? Yeah, tree. I can understand we're probably saying the same thing. We have the same meaning. It's harder in this world, but there's so much. I just think we could do so much better. I think we could be so much clearer.
That's very well said. And that is one of the common complaints of people. Oh, words are empty, words are hollow. Words are just pointers which can never really point to the true experience. And yet they spend hours and hours and hours talking about it, right?
So why are you talking?
Then why are you talking? If you're going to talk, if you're going to use language, understanding that it's a substitute, it's
Yeah,
it's
absolutely
symbolic, it's metaphorical, there's no way any two people can know with any 100% accuracy that they're really describing the same thing to each other. But we use these tools that we have. That's all we have to communicate with each other. But if we're going to use those tools, then why use the blunt versions of them? Use the most precise version you can. And so I try to be, when I write, as precise as possible with my language, because I find, I mean, people make up words in this industry, like awakeness, like, fuck, you print something out on a Word document, you get spell check errors all over the place. those words don't even exist in the dictionary. And we've just like started manufacturing words to point to experiences because we feel like, oh, there's no language for those kind of experiences that the material that the world has or that human society has. No, like the English vocabulary is one of the most extensive, if not the most extensive vocabulary of any of the languages on the planet. If you can't make do with all the thousands of words we have at our disposal, then you're probably not saying anything very important anyways. That's worth listening to, right? But yeah, on that vein, I feel like, you know, a lot of people would think that we've wasted the last 2 hours of our time conversing, but I think it's been a fantastic use of my time, to be honest with you. I've really, really, really enjoyed this conversation. And I feel like you and I could probably go another couple of hours like a Joe Rogan podcast if we had to. But unfortunately, I have kids to pick up from school and all of those kinds of things. And
in normal human life.
A normal human life that I'm very intimate with. And I know you're highly intimate with your own life as well. And it's a pleasure for me to engage with people like yourself who bring that the depth of spiritual experience combined with the breadth of experience at the real, everyday, mundane level of life, engaging with the world, engaging with society, engaging with politics and all of that. It's been a breath of fresh air for me. And I think you have so much to offer on so many different topics that I think it's going to be a great podcast for many of my listeners to listen to.
I appreciate that. Those are very kind words. Thank you. This has been fantastic, and it's rare to find many people talking about just even the broad spiritual topics, and it's rarer still to, I think, really be able to. I think this is very constructive. People might look at this and think, oh, it's critique, they're just giving them a hard time or whatever. But I think for us both, our motivation in saying this is because we've seen so many people that spend a lifetime going in circles and barking up the wrong tree. This has nothing to do with critiquing how anybody does anything. It's that I fundamentally believe these things are non-functional and they cause harm. They do damage to people who legitimately care about these topics. And that's worth talking about, and that's worth teasing apart, because there is something profound in this whole journey. I mean, I am grateful. My overwhelming experience is one of gratitude in all of this. And my life has been profoundly altered for everything that I would say, to the contrary, to try to clean up some of these misconceptions. It's just not in the way that people think. And so, people might look at this as like, I don't know, some sort of criticism or, whatever, but it's incredibly important. And I think for both of us, it's because we give a shit about these people, because we were that person, because that was me. I know what happened to me, what happened to you in trying to navigate those waters. And, not everybody comes out on the other side with a little bit of perspective, able to be like, wait a minute, like, there's some issues here. So, I hope, your listeners and people that, decide to listen to this can get something of value out of that. And, we spent a lot of time talking about society, and, that may not be the topic maybe that people came here for, but I think there's something really important in that. And it's my other big commentary on the spiritual world community is that it polarizes people against ordinary human life. It's like, you can't both be awakened and spiritual and, work on Wall Street or, go to Senate, or God forbid you work for an oil company, you do this or that. They're like complete opposites, or even care about those issues. And I think that's really detrimental and damaging towards your actual human life, which you're going to live till the day you die. The actually awakening, I think, is the big permission slip to fully inhabit your life. All of it, all the things that go on, it's suddenly those are redeemed. It's part of the whole, and that's what you get out of this. You get out of this that all of these things actually are part of the whole, and it redeems those. And so not only is it dysfunctional to your personal life, but it's dysfunctional to your awakening journey. Like if the only thing you give a shit about, and I was that person, I've been there, is literally just awakening, you breaking off your life into pieces and getting incredibly fragmented away and hating society and thinking these are non-spiritual, this is spiritual, even if you don't think you're doing it, is actually going to impede your entire journey. Like it's, even if that's all you care about, it's really important to break this apart.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. And I agree with you that the reason we're as passionate about what we're saying is because we do give a shit, not because we don't, right? And that's the common misunderstanding that I find I encounter with people when I speak, is that they think that, oh, you're being contrarian because you don't give a shit about what I give a shit about.
Yeah.
But it's actually the opposite. We give a shit. And that is why this is so sort of motivating to the way we express ourselves, right? But it was great chatting with you, Steven. And it seems like, we might end up doing this again sometime in the future. And I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about then. So until then, hope you have a good day.
You too. Thank you.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.